to the main board. Bam. All right, so the first game we have here is you on the black end versus Victor Gyoza.
Well, Gyozo
Okay.
Forentos.
Mm-hmm.
And, I have to say, another trap that I fell into when I was a young, improving player, like even when I was 2350, 2400 moving up, is I was too overwhelmingly impressed if I'd seen some guy's name in print. I was like, oh. So I think Forentos had done a book on the Petrov defense, with some other guy,
Mm-hmm.
And so now the story with this, do you have a copy of the picture of the Petrosian book of games?
Yes, let me go ahead and pull that up real quick.
So this game took place in Lone Pine, California. Okay, Lone Pine is like if you're going from San Francisco to Las Vegas, I think it is, and it's one of those literally one red light towns. If you blink and pass through the light, you missed it. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but in the early 70s, we were blessed to have some fantastic tournaments there, and the reason being is that this millionaire inventor, Louis D. Statham, lived in Lone Pine, and he actually built a very nice hall, a little auditorium, specifically for the chess tournament, which came once a year. And he would invite the best players he could, try to reach out to the Russians, get some good Russian players, and some of the best players he could. And then they would invite some of the top talented, young American players, and they would have various rating cutoffs. As the tournament got stronger and stronger, of course, the rating criteria went up.
Mm-hmm.
And so, give you an idea, for example, some of the young players that played there during those years were guys like Yasser Sarwan, John Fedorowicz, Nick DeFermian, Christensen. In fact, a lot of us would play basketball at the local gym. So anyway, Statham built this hall specifically for the chess tournament. I mean, like, you didn't even hear the doors when they closed. At a normal cafeteria, your door closes, you hear the loud clang, clang. Yep. Oh, no, these were like, and then basically the town got to use it the rest of the year for their community town hall meetings, whatever. But once a year, the chess tournament was the big thing, came to town. And so I don't remember if this was my first, second, one year I caught a bus during my college years, would have been 76. It doesn't say here what year this was, but I think this was a little later. I actually caught a bus from Mobile, Alabama.
1976.
3 days, 3-day bus ride. Horrible. I finished almost last, but I won one game, a queen and pawn in game against David Strauss, an international master, I think it was. Took about 80 or 90 moves. Queen and knight pawn versus queen. But I was determined, man, I'm going to win this game. But this particular game, so this particular year, Petrosian was playing. He was one of the two Russians. Usually they would invite two Russians. It might have been Smyslov, might have been the other. Okay. So anyway,
interesting to hear those names from back when you were playing. That's really cool.
No, I mean, for me, it was like meeting legends. Like, I'd studied collections of these guys' games, and it was like to see them in person. It would be like you being a soccer player and meeting Pele or Diego Maradona or someone. Well, Diego Maradona sober,
Got you.
Sorry, non-secreture there.
That's fine.
By the way, Diego Maradona plays chess. There's a picture of him playing chess. He actually quite likes chess, There's a talk show in their country where he was actually on and met Karpov, and they played, 5 or 6 moves and agreed to a draw or something,
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, but I digress. Okay, so this particular year, Petrosian is there, and I think Smyslov. And so anyway, at the tournament hall, like 10 in the morning, usually the games are like, say, 1 in the afternoon, they start. But about 10:30, they post the pairings, and you could go and check your pairing. And I happened to see Petrosian there. Well, I knew he was in the tournament, so I'm carrying around a copy of my book, Tigran Petrosian, by, what is it, Life and Games of Tigran Petrosian by Vic Vasiliev, okay? Never heard of Vic Vasiliev before, since, or after, okay? But anyway, I'd gone through the book, and I see Petrosian, and I go up to him, and I have the game turned to my favorite game, and I ask him if he'll autograph it. And so he looks at the diagram, and it's not coming back to him right away. And he flips back a few pages, and he sees, Spassky Petrosian World Championship match, 1966. I don't know, maybe game 14 or something. And then he Then he goes back to the page I had it on, and then he autographs, "To Ron, good luck, Tigran Petrosian." Of course you can barely read it, But on the other hand, so that's 10:30 in the morning. So already this is like one of the best days of my life, right? Anyway, go back to the hotel, eat, shower, nap, whatever, and go start playing my game. I'm black against Giozo Furentos. Okay. So let's see what happened. Giozo Furentos, I think at that time, maybe I'd only played, I drew my very first grandmaster was Arthur Bisgar in Mobile, Alabama one year playing, and I was like 1900 at the time. And then I don't remember if I'd played any other grandmasters in between. Probably. So anyway, so in those days, I was a King's Indian defense kind of guy. And you can see white has, if my knight comes to c6, it would actually be an exact closed Sicilian reverse. Okay. So anyway, knight there. He's playing a very flexible pawn formation. Castles. And now I play old school knight bd7. Again, knight to c6, bishop to e6. That would be kind of standard textbook, English or closed Sicilian reverse, if you will. But now he plays d3. Not really sure why he didn't play d4. But of course, on d4, I'd play rook e8 and try to go for e4. And, fantasize about being a King's Indian attack player like Bobby Fischer, So now I play knight h5. I want to play pawn to f5. Okay, that's what you do in the King's Indian. You get the pawn duo up there, and then you hope you can play f4 or e4 and try and generate some attack. Against players, it works. Against good players, they freeze your pawns and then they crush you on the queen side. But hey, them's the breaks. Well, now, to my utter amazement, the guy plays pawn to g4. Well, not a lot of choice here, right, Matthew? Got to retreat tonight.
Come back.
Okay. It's too early to go Tal or Neshmedinov on him. But now he goes knight to g3. So you know what my thoughts were here, Matthew?
Not quite. I mean...
No, but psychologically. Here's my thought.
Okay.
I've never seen this g4, knight g3. But you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, wow, this must be like a known standard crush on the Grandmaster Tour. But all that notwithstanding, we still got to play our next move and find a plan, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, darn it, couldn't get in f5 that way. Let's go this way. I mean, that was really my thought. That's how much respect I had for these guys, because I'd seen his name in print because he'd done a book on the Petrov, I'm like, wow, this must be like a standard crush on the Grandmaster Tour. So now Christensen was great about that. He had no respect, no fear of anyone, Just thought he was God's gift to the game, and that was that, and they were lucky to be playing with him. If I'd have had that kind of confidence, who knows where I would have gone. Up 500, down 500, who knows?
Well, you hit GM, so you must have done something right.
Anyway, so he goes bishop d2. So he's not playing in super aggressive fashion, okay? So anyway, first I go knight c5. Well, that's pretty clear. We're touching the pawn. Let's see. You told me how to make arrows here or something. Let's see if I learned anything.
If you hold control and click, or just drag with
Control,
the right click the mouse.
Oh, right click. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
All right.
Have you ever thought about being a chess teacher? Elite chess teacher.
Sometimes.
Okay, so you can see the pawn on d3 is under attack. So queen e2, he's, making his development and so forth. And now I go queen h4. I mean, look, I don't know much, but I know he does not have a knight to come to f3, and I know his pawn on g4 is under attack. It might be a standard Grandmaster crush, but hey, I am attacking his pawn. Now he plays f3, which that's kind of an ugly move. If anything, I was really expecting h3, okay? But then I could target it with like h5 or f5 if I want. Anyway, he played f3. That kind of surprised me. Well, it may be a standard Grandmaster crush, but I know I need to anchor my knight on c5. That's like King's Indian Defense 101, right? Okay. So now he goes bishop e1, and now I see the point of f3. Okay, so time to beat a retreat. I play queen back. And now, if he goes knight in to d5, I'll just go queen back to d8 and give it the boot, okay?
Yeah.
So he goes king in the corner, but now I take away knight d5. Okay. So, it's a game. His pawns all on the third rank make a little bit of a weird impression. But now, by the way, do you have a chess program giving an evaluation anywhere along here?
I
I've
don't have
never
it
looked
turned
at
on.
these games. Keep in mind, chess base, didn't really gain utility until like the late 80s, early 90s. So I've never actually really looked at most of these games under the microscope of a Fritz slash Stockfish slash Houdini or whatever.
Hmm.
So anyway, he goes rook over. I go f5. Mission accomplished. Okay. So he takes, take. Now he goes knight h4, going after my bishop. Okay, so save the bishop. He goes f4, freezing my pawn.
Hmm.
Now, Grandmaster Lombardi, the late great William Lombardi, tremendous talent, fantastic understanding of domination and so forth. He told me once, your opponent has a good piece in your territory, you got to get rid of it. If it means sacrificing the exchange to chop it off, whatever you do, you can't just let it camp out. You got to get rid of it.
Right.
So if I trade a knight on the back rank for his only guy that's in my territory, that's probably not bad. So he goes bishop g3. By the way, Matthew,
Yes.
very important point in chess. It's amazing, absolutely amazing how far you can get in chess by simply taking what they give you. I know that sounds obvious, but it's so true. Like opponent wants to zip out and give you the bishop pair. Okay. Now king off, vacate the g file. Okay. Now he goes rook over.
Hmm.
So I'm still not a bit clear. There's a lot of potential tension in the center. He's got a lot of pawn breaks, but I figure he goes rook over. Bam. Let's go e4 and jam him up. Okay. Now, do you have a Stockfish or a computer here? Does it give any evaluation here?
Yeah, evaluation. I turn it on for the viewers so that they can see the bar. Currently, it is at plus 0.2 at depth
0, 0.2. So it's very close to equal, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And did it like to move e4? I thought e4 was excellent.
E4 or A4, both are equal.
Is the best move?
Or A4 or E4, yeah.
Oh, okay. A4 makes sense too. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, A4 might loosen up this knight sometimes. That's typical play. Okay. So anyway, now he takes. Now, again, trade-offs, pluses and minuses. He does have a connected passed f pawn, right? And I do have a quote potential weak d6 pawn. But again, which brings to mind why he didn't play f5 here. Oh, I guess I would play the same as in the game, knight to d3 or bishop e5.
Hmm.
But the whole crux of the King's Indian, and if you want to play the King's Indian defense with black, required must reading is Zurich 1953. That was kind of the coming out party for the King's Indian. And two classic games in that, you have to see Averbach white against Kotov, although they got to an old Indian, but they got this kind of position where black had the weak pawn on d6 because black repositioned his bishop from e7 to g7. And you absolutely have to see the game Reshevsky versus Bronstein, which this pawn structure with the pawn on d6, again, they're static versus dynamic. So the backward pawn on a half-open file is a static type of weakness. But the offset is that black has dynamic counterplay. The knight on c5 potentially can go to d3. The bishop on g4, he's got activity. He's got an open line for the bishop. So that game, Reshevsky, Bronstein, Zurich 1953. And by the way, this is not just my opinion. Grandmaster Julian Hodgson, fantastic talent from England, was the guy who put the trompe on the map, in fact. But he played through that Zurich 53 tournament book like it was a Bible, I mean, that would be like one of the 10 island chess books. If you had to go to an island, what are the books you take? Well, of course, Fischer's 800 and however many games, the later version, okay? Mm-hmm. You take Kasparian's domination in 2,400 and 545 in games, and you take Zurich 53 maybe, and then you go from there, okay?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to write all these down.
But anyway, I'm sure everyone wrote that down religiously. Okay. But let's see. So I'm saying if you had to go to an island where there's no internet,
Yes.
Okay. All you got is your wooden chess pieces that you've now carved meticulously. Okay. And so anyway, but in turn 53, in the 50s, the Russians, guys like Boleslavsky, showed that the pawn on d6, even though it's potentially weak and a target, but it also offers chances for dynamic counterplay, and it's a question of dynamics versus static. So on the downside, the bishop on g3 does not impress, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that you can do, Matthew, that is extremely helpful is do what I call a relative value comparison, okay?
Okay.
You compare your pieces to theirs, like to like, okay?
Right.
So the black bishop on g7 is fantastic. You know, he's raking up and down this diagonal, okay? I didn't even draw that arrow. The bishop felt so good, he just fired it out there himself. Let's see that again. Okay.
I'm drawing arrows for you.
Okay. What else? The knight on c5 clearly has much better potential than his counterpart on c3, okay? You can see that knight's just waiting to lurch in there, okay? And so, so one way you can evaluate a position is to look at your pieces, look at his pieces, and just compare like to like, okay?
Yeah.
Very simple thing, but amazing. And sometimes that'll give you a clue. Wow, his bishop's really dominating. Wow, we got to get rid of that guy, okay? Okay, so anyway, is it okay if we go over? I'm sure we're over time.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I mean, it's your time, so thank you very much.
You just put it in 3 or 4 segments, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so anyway, so he goes queen, and there you see, case in point, he's got the battery here. He's looking to come down and exploit my weak pawn.
Right.
Well, no time to be shy, duck in. Now here, he might do well to just consider sacrificing the exchange. Some kind of knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, something like that, maybe. Although bishop takes e4 is a bit tricky. Bishop takes c3, but then he can play queen takes d3.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And bishop takes e4, I could probably play knight takes the rook first. And then, oh, I can't do bishop c3. He's got queen c3 check. So I don't have time to play queen takes e4. Anyway, though, he could seriously consider some kind of capture on e4, sack the exchange. Yeah, game goes on. Okay. In the game, he played rook f1. Well, now I play bishop f5, anchor banker. You know, that knight is in there. Okay.
Yeah.
So now he goes king g1.
Stop. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, obviously, if he tries to take, like on e4, I take, and he can't, and he takes. I take with check, so it doesn't have time to collect the knight on d3. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that explains king to g1. Okay. But now I play an excellent, very dynamic move, and this is like very keeping in spirit of the King's Indian.
Okay.
I play d5. And this is a temporary pawn sack to blast open the position. Now, of course, in 2020, you know, every Russian schoolboy would look at d5, right? Even some American schoolboys. Okay. It's a very thematic move in the Sicilian defense, for example. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, he takes, but if he doesn't take, I'm just going to put something on, I'm just going to protect that d5 pawn, connect the dots. Okay. Yeah. So, and then good luck getting rid of that knight on d3. You know? so he kind of has to take. Mm-hmm. Okay. But now counterattack, queen to c5. So we're attacking the knight. Okay. He goes knight back to c3. Mm-hmm. And then, bam, knight takes b2. And you can see we're exploiting the fragility of the knight. Okay. Now, again, he could try sacking an exchange for knight takes e4, but it's probably not totally sufficient. Mm-hmm. And so he takes on b2. But here's the point. Of course, I can play bishop takes c3 and get the piece back. But first, the old Schwissenschach. Now, of course, we know that's an in-between move. That's a check, right? Yep. Schwischen, in between, shock for check, right? Okay. Back in the corner, and then bam, queen takes. So now, either you trade queens or you take back the pawn on b7. So he takes back the pawn on b7. Okay, so in the words of the great author Jeremy Silman, let's reassess our chess, right? Remember we talked about value comparison, right?
Yes. Well,
let's look at this pawn on e4 versus the pawn on f4.
Okay.
They're both passed pawns, but one is firmly blockaded, okay? Mm-hmm. And the other, you know, could be motoring right up the board.
Right.
let's look at these bishops. Okay, let's look at this guy. Let's see. How did you say we do? If we want
Just
to make,
click.
oh, right click. Okay, and then if we do control,
Change
we
color.
can see this guy.
Yep.
Well, this guy needs to find a job, right? Rather than protecting 2 of white's remaining 3 pawns, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyway, rook at a to b8. At this point, I no longer felt I'd fallen into the standard grandmaster crush. I mean, my pieces were all active. He hadn't laid a glove on my king. I even have a passed pawn. I got an open file. Yeah, it's not so bad. Okay, so he goes queen away. Bam, 7th rank. Grandmaster crush or no, I know the 7th rank is good stuff for rooks. They love 7th rank, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm threatening to take his pawn, and then I'll have this guy. So he plays rook up. So I trade. And then bishop to g4. Show the rook a little love.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but that's actually only part of the point. The real apple of my eye, being a King's Indian defense player, is I want to go eliminate this guy and then start saying hello to his king. You can see if I snake that bishop into f3, trade that guy, hit him with a fat queen check, put a rook on the g file, this is
GG.
like, yeah, right. Exactly. This is how Fischer and Kasparov mated people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he surprised me yet again. He goes bishop d4. I'm like, how can he do this? He's just forcing me to trade. But I'm like, okay, take. And now we have a rook and bishop versus rook and bishop in game.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one other very cool study point that I would tell you here, okay? Remember I said I like to study whole games for openings. When I'm annotating games and I get to this point right here, I make a note. Rook plus bishop versus rook plus bishop in game.
From the opening that you played. Okay.
No. The opening, put like in the game header and everything.
Okay.
And then even somewhere in the game header, I may even I'll make a note,
Mm-hmm.
maybe insert a diagram, and I put rook plus bishop versus rook plus bishop in game.
Okay.
And what that does is it makes a mental marker for you to wake up. We're in an in game now. We're not an opening. This is an in game. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is this type of in game. And if young players get in the habit of doing this, it will dramatically improve their in game play.
Mm-hmm.
You get a lot of young players, queens come off the board, they lose interest in the game. But we see from Magnus Carlsen, everyone thinks of Magnus as a great attacking player, but truth is he's a great in-game player, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And over half the games he actually wins are in the in-game. If you go back to the 2013 World Championship, what was it, game 3 or 4? It was at the point where he was black, and they had a queen and rook versus queen and rook in-game. And he made, the queens came off, and then at one point, he gives Anand, the reigning world champion, 2 outside pass pawns on A and B or C and B files. And he had like double pawns on the king side, but he saw he could get in and then force the win with his F pawn, okay? And this is against the reigning world champion to give him 2 connected pass pawns.
Yeah.
Now, possibly Anand could have drawn it, but later I began to realize Anand's weakness probably is rook in games. It's been noted by some very high level players.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, we're not talking basic rook innings. We're talking like, 3,000 level in games.
Right.
And so Magnus has exploited this more than once. But my point, though, is to highlight so that you become interested, that you become fascinated with, that this is like Ulf Anderson, the great Ulf Anderson. He'd show up to play you. He'd have his sweater. He'd have his mug for his tea or whatever, And then the queens would come off the board. Now the sweater comes off. He has a sip of his tea, and now he's down to business. Now it's a day at the office for him, and he'll sit there with you for 8 or 10 hours, whatever it takes. Ulf Anderson, before computers, won queen and 8 pawn versus queen twice in tournament games. Okay, twice he won that in game. I was proud that I won queen and 8 pawn. He won queen and 8 pawn twice before computers. Okay, so the in games, there's a lot of points to be harvested in games. At the scholastic level, every coach teaches their kid tactics and openings. And look, Matthew, my belief is you can get to 1700 if you just are good at tactics. You see all the 1 and 2 movers, and you have your openings down. You probably get to 1700. But if you want to make that push to master, you got to start learning pawn strategy, pawn structures, and somewhere along the way, you really have to learn in-game technique. Like, well, this is game. First Grandmaster. I'm not going to blow him off the board, with an attack. These guys defend themselves, But now we got to this end game. So.
In the meantime, I was trying to look up that game you were talking about.
Do what?
In the meantime, I was trying to look up the game between Carlsen and Nand. I was able to find it. And yeah, that's pretty incredible.
Game 3 or game 6? Game 5? Carlsen was black.
It was game 6. Yep.
Game 6? Okay. Yeah, pull up. Can you pull up like later when they get to this rook ending where Carlsen's penetrating, he's got his double pawns? I mean, it's amazing. It's like he could have just repeated moves and made a draw. Okay. But no, he goes in with his king, sacrifices a pawn, gets his king down. Finally, Anand has to give up his rook for the passed f pawn or something, And by the way, I think that game turned the tide in his favor or gave him like +2 or something. That was like critical game in the match.
Yeah. I mean, not in a million years would I ever think, let me give my opponent 2 connected passers. Oh my goodness.
Okay.
All right. Sorry. Go ahead.
So anyway, but this is a very useful technique. When I save my games in chess base and I get to a position like this, I make a note. Rook and knight versus rook and bishop. 2 bishop versus bishop in game. Okay. Because it frames it in my mind, and then later if I want to pull it up, that's another story. Okay. So what happened here? Well, passed pawns must be pushed. Push that puppy. Okay. He gets behind it. Push again. He kicks my bishop. Okay. Challenge time. What do we do here?
Well, it's a tactic, so pause your videos, guys, on YouTube if you want to take a moment to try to figure it out. And in Twitch, you got something in chat. Go for it. Obviously, you can move your bishop. That would be my thought. But I started looking at checks and captures.
Okay, checks and captures.
2 captures.
Damn, there's a capture.
There it is.
Okay, so it's a deflection rook sack. Obviously, if he takes the rook, you promote the pawn, right? But here's part 2. So he goes rook e8 check, bails out the rook. You step up with the king, but now if he takes the bishop, then you go rook f1 check.
Wow.
And see then, well, he obviously would have to move up. You win the rook. He takes your bishop, but then you have a pretty easy, you go rook to e2, and you probably pick up the a2 pawn, you see? For a pretty easy rook versus bishop win.
Yeah.
So he goes king g1, covering the f1 square. So now we chill with the bishop and tap his rook. Well, he goes rook back to e3. Rook obviously has to, keep an eye on, the little monster, right? Now we bring the king up. He goes a3. So now he's beginning to realize he runs out of moves. If the bishop, heads down this way, for example, or moves anywhere, then he gives up access to the f1 square, you see? So he can't move. He goes a3, okay? I go h6. I learned this kind of thing from Petrosian or Karpov, just those little Capablanca, just those little quiet moves where you run them out, okay? You run him out of moves. In fact, his rook almost has no move up and down the file, you see? So we saw if he moves his bishop, we go rook into f1. If he moves his king, we go rook to f1, okay? If he moves either pawn, he starts to put him on pre. And so basically, this is already zigzwang. See?
Wow. That's really
No,
cool.
Look, he can't move the rook to the side. You just queen. We got every square. See, this is like mini domination. We got every square on the file covered, okay? So I think it was maybe about this point or a few moves later. I think a few moves later. So he plays h4. What to do? Now I improve the bishop. Now he does have a square for his rook. Okay, now what does he do here? He pitches the pawn. I go king up. He goes rook up. I go king h4. And now it's kind of a zigzwang all over again. We saw that he cannot move the bishop. I got all the squares covered. If he moves the bishop anywhere down this way, we go in check. Now, how do I get rid of those arrows?
Just click on the board anywhere.
I just go back. Okay. And so, and again, if he moves the king, we go rook f1. And so about all he has left to move is the rook or the a pawn.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is about the point. Petrosian comes up somewhere around here. I think right around here when I'm playing king g5 or something. And he starts to watch the game. And he looks at it. And then he begins to realize that white's in zigzag. And he sits back, just leans back a little, has this little small, looks at me. And then he has this little small smile on his face like, my student, That was, Matthew, you can't imagine, like a former world champion, a legend, someone you idolized growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and sees you beat your first grandmaster. I mean, that was like one of the greatest moments of my chess career,
Mm-hmm.
just, for him to actually be there and see that, And then, I think right about here, Ferento studied for a while. Petrosian was there. He was watching. And then after Ferentos resigned, Petrosian left and so forth. But you can see in the final position, not much for white to do. He can move his rook somewhere. I'm just going to snip this guy. I'm going to push this guy. Eventually, I'll either go in with my king or I'll come back with my king. I'll push the pawn to h3. I'll overload his circuits. Okay.
Yeah.
And, or I can capture this guy, put my bishop back on g4, put the pawn on h5, and then I can probably send the rook over to try and collect this guy on the other side. I could play rook back across. If rook e3, I could take it again, hit him with another deflection. So basically, he's going to be a second pawn down with no counterplay. Probably I would never release the zigzag position. I'd probably just zigzag, and then after I collect this guy, play h5, and then I'd probably just bring my king, and come back across the board, and then I'd collect this guy on the other side. And then that would be the guy that would, tilt his circuits. Okay. But
just make him suffer.
But yeah, that was a great memory. And Lone Pine continued, I think, up until around 78 or so. Eventually, Louis D. Statham passed away. But it provided in the 70s, in a time when Americans normally had to either travel possibly to New York for Bill Goichberg tournaments or to Europe to get international opportunities. Lone Pine provided a whole generation of young players fantastic opportunities to play top-notch competition, you know. And so, it really helped develop players like myself. Sirwan had some fantastic performances. I know DeFermian, Fedorowicz, all these guys, that whole generation, Christensen, got to play there.